Hello guys, welcome to the session wherein we're going to talk about APIs. So there would be barely any app that you would be noticing that doesn't come with an API. And here I'm going to simplify APIs in case of Flutter. Now, we know that the benefits of Flutter. So what benefits do we hold? One is when we start with an app development, we get an Android and iOS app. More upon, when it comes to the other front ends, we can compile our app and then create an app on that front end. Now, when it comes to APIs, this benefits for app development. Well, this is one of the prime features that any app would be having. For example, we will talk about post, get, a put, and a delete. Well, when it comes to APIs, let me just first explain you how the APIs they get created, how your app interacts with the APIs, what all things you will be requiring, and how should you follow the good practices in order to do so. Well, let me write it down so that we don't miss out on any step. So I'm going to highlight or in fact make a flow chart so that you guys can exactly follow the same steps into your app development. Now, starting off with, I'm going to check whether you guys have any knowledge of what are mobile APIs or how your app get connected to the server. Well, what we're going to do is, in this case, let's imagine you have an app. Let's say you're creating a music player app. Now, what you're allowing to the user is to connect to a remote cloud server and then fetch your music files from there. So what you're trying to do is, when your app is or your phone is connected to internet, so I'll put over here on live internet. What it will try and do, it will try to connect to this remote server. Let's say it picks an ABC MP4 file, and this ABC MP4 file is then sent back to the app. Now, what we're talking about is a music player app. Let's imagine that your music player, you basically have a server catering to 1 million songs. Now, it is impossible that you would be having a device that could afford or that could be having this kind of a storage. So in this case, what we are trying to do is we're trying to break down your entire load from the device into a remote server where the files are stored, and then over here we are going to create a streaming. So here is my app that streams the music. Well, now this all happens over the internet. Now, be it any app, you will notice that most of the things are saved onto the remote server. So, first, how do you connect to the server? Well, what I'm going to show to you now is certain documentations that you need to follow, and you have to adhere to them, and you'll be able to connect to the remote server. Now, what I'll do is over here, yeah. Now, first, I would want to understand. Do you guys have an understanding of what are different type of APIs? Can someone let me know in the chat box how you guys are going to have your app to get connected to an backend server, and what are the different type of APIs the backend would be there? I'm going to wait for 10 seconds. Okay. Yeah, I have an answer. Yeah, you're partially correct. Okay. So, what someone has replied to me in the chat box is how they can be using is with the help of get APIs. Now, you, my friend, are partially correct. So, why did I say partially correct? Is because now in this scenario, when we are trying to get the data or get the music file from the server, we have something called as a get API. Hence, over here, let me show it to you as a live example that we are going to use a get API and then get some details from our server into our app. Now, in this case, what I'm going to do is first add something called as an HTTP Flutter plugin. Now, what is this HTTP Flutter plugin? It helps us to connect to the API server. So I'll copy this thing and add it to my pubsec YAML file, like over here. Now, what I'll do is, before I dive into the code, let me help you in understanding how I would be doing it. First, I need something called as an endpoint. Now, what is an endpoint? The data or the API where we are going to get the data from. So in this case, I'm going to go and use this fake store API. This is an online repository which can get you data from the server. And what I'll do is over here, I'm going to clone my GitHub repository and show to you how we can do it step by step. Now, what I'll do is I'm also going to share this entire project on GitHub and put the link in the chat in the video description. Now, I'll have this GitHub project and here's my app. Yeah. Now, what I'm going to start off with, I'm going to start off with first connecting to the backend or API server. So, the first plugin which we require is an HTTP plugin, followed by something called as a freezed plugin. Yeah. So if you guys are hearing it for the first time, freezed is one of the plugins which help you create models faster. Now, what I'll do is over here, I'm going to run my code. So I'll go to the repository. Now, well, these are the models that I'll be requiring. So I'll go over here, first get the request followed by my response. Well, now what is a request? What is a response? Okay, when I was talking about the endpoint, I told you guys that this is the API. Now, where is the endpoint? This URL is my endpoint. So, what do you mean by an endpoint? Well, when it comes to APIs, you have this URL, and when you hit this, you'll be able to get this data. So, I'll put it over my JSON viewer and show it to you that this actually is a JSON data that we could be using into our app. Now, over here, what I also have is images for certain products. So if you would see, this is like product ID followed by product title, so on and so forth. And this way you have around 20 products to get displayed. Now what I'm going to do is first explain you that after we have an endpoint, what should be the second step that you should be having into your app development. Now imagine the same scenario where you're getting data from the server and I am going to make a request. So what is the request? Now, let's say the app opens, it goes to the server and makes a request. So I'll put over here a request. What is the request? Give me this music file. The server now locates that music file and sends it back to the app. So that basically corresponds to my response. And this exactly is where we are going to have our APIs talking to each other or talking to the client, which is your mobile app, which connects to the backend server. Okay, now in this case, what I'm going to do is first talk about this freeze plugin. So in this case, I'm going to add over here something called as freeze now. I'm going to go and add freeze annotation and a build running. So this is going to help us in gathering all the things that we would be requiring for our API. So for example, if I were to add any model, let's see now when it comes to this JSON that you see, this is a language or this is the output wherein I have from the server. Now, this JSON data I need to convert into a Dart model. So let me show you how quickly you can do it with the help of this freeze plugin. Now, in this case, what I'll try and do is try to locate my product model that's over here. I'll copy this, add over here a new directory as models, and I'll keep this product model. Now, when it comes to talking to the app or talking to the server, it's going to have one more stage called as serialization and deserialization. Now, let us understand it practically rather than me just talking about all these technical concepts. So, now what I'll do is I'll add a JSON serialization letter and I'll take this plugin, copy it into our app. When I do a pub get, you guys will notice that all the files shall get downloaded onto my device, and then I'll be able to run through it. Now, what I'll do is over here, I'll put this as 2.4.0. Yeah. Let it be. Okay. Now, what I'll try and do is over here, even if it shows an error, what I'll try and explain you is the product model. Yeah. So you notice that this is my JSON, and I'll take this JSON, just one part of it, and I'll open it in JSON viewer. Well, now what do we have over here? This part wherein we have your ID, this is called as a JSON key, against which there is one, which is a value. So what I'll do is over here, when it comes to my ID, I'm going to create a variable as integer because this is a number, followed by my title, price, description, so on and so forth. So what I'm trying to do over here is creating all the models that we would be requiring. Now, let me see if any one of you has a question until now. Okay. Now, what we're going to understand, as we have all the plugins to be ready, let's see whether we are able to run through our app or not. Now, let me go on and close this. Yeah. Now, when we are trying to see this app to get built, you'll notice that I have carefully segregated my different projects. Now, I'll talk about an API. You'll notice I have created something called as an API repository. Now, let me explain to you what is an API repository. So I'm going to close this and go over again to my whiteboard, create an API repository. So this API repository is going to be a list of files that I'm going to create when we are going to get the data from the server. Now, step number one is to create models. Step number two is to create a repository. And step number three is to create something called as a view. Combining these three steps is what in mobile is a very popular framework known as MVVM. So I'm going to put over here this MVVM as an abbreviation, which basically means model, view, and view model. What is this? Basically the abbreviation for MVVM. Now, what I'll try and do is in this case, we're going to have first our models, second our repositories, and third the view to get created. If you follow this step, you are bound to get any kind of a data from the server. Now let's see if you guys have any questions to ask to me when it comes to MVVM. If you guys know about mobile architectures, just mention it all on the chat box. Okay. Now I just received one query. What is basically this repository? Okay. Now let me explain you what is this repository. So when it comes to app development, you are just not one person who would be involved into this app. It might be a team of developers that would be creating the app. Now, having followed this structure will help everyone in the team to get along. For example, look over here. I have something called as hit server to fetch the products. Now, if you would notice over here, I'm having something called as a first block in which I'm going to, yeah, so in which I'm going to get the product list, okay, and then I'm going to show the entire product into my output. What I'll do is I'm going to quickly connect my phone and then show to you how exactly will be the output from this case. So here I have connected my phone and I'll share my screen again and I'm going to run my app. Yeah. So let us see the output first, and you'll notice that in another few minutes my .apk file will get generated. What we're going to talk about meanwhile is how to parse the response. Okay. Now, once we are, where is the request? So over here, I'll go to my API repository and have this future function. Now, any idea of you guys of what is a future function? Let me know in the comment box if you have any kind of a question. It can read the response or it can give us an error. Let's imagine that your user is into a very remote area where the internet connection is weak. In that case, the user has given it back to you. Now, what I'll do is over here show you and talk about what is status code followed by what is a response. Now, when it comes to our server, it has got different status codes. For example, it denotes that everything went okay, followed by basically 4, which basically means the endpoint is wrong and we need to check. So in this way, these are the standard conventions you would be noticing that exist in any kind of an backend architecture that will be there into your app also. So what I'm going to do is drag your attention to this point, wherein we have our entire status code for 200, which basically which basically tells us that everything went fine, and we can show this list of products. Next, what I'm going to do is over here show to you how did I pass this request and the response. So, do you notice I've wrapped it in try and a catch? If you would see, I'm following good practices. If everything goes fine, I'm returning the value. If anything goes wrong, I'm returning an error. This kind of ensures that the user does not see the loading symbol endlessly, and it either sees a success or either sees an error at the output. Now, what I'll do is over here go through my first page and explain you how we are going to handle the different states. Now, when it comes to handling different states, this is where your Flutter knowledge should be very good. Look over here. Be it any kind of an API, there will be three stages in which you successfully got the data, followed by if anything goes wrong in the loading and there are no data available, then you'll be getting this error. Over here, you're going to display the error message and show it on the UI. So let me just check if you guys have any queries until this point. Yeah, okay. So now I'm going to start. I'll click on entire screen. Yeah. So if you would notice, what I have done is yeah. So over here, I'm going to paste. Yeah, and you'll notice that from 0 to 19, there is each array holding some value, and this is getting the data from the server. In same way, we can also push the data into the server. So over yeah. So what I have done is created something called as the second page, in which I'm going to get the data from the second page and display it on the UI. So over here, what you'll notice is again my API repository to get used, and this time you're going to see post request model. Yeah. So my APK got generated, and let me show it to you. How does the app look like? Yeah. So there is a bit amount of loading, and followed by this list of products. So if you're wondering how did we create this list of products, is if you would see over here, the very first product is a backpack. Let me just show it to you. See over here, there's a backpack, and that's exactly my phone displaying the backpack. Now over here, similarly, you'll see other different products. As I keep scrolling, those products get loaded onto the app, and it will be exactly in the order from which you're getting it from the server. Now, since we have done one part of the API, that is get API, I'm going to take your questions and see if there are something that you guys have a query to ask to me. Yeah. Now, what I'm going to do is on the same app, when I go to the second page, you guys will notice I have created three buttons: post API, put API, and delete API. Now, let us understand with JSON placeholder how do you do this. So this is my JSON placeholder, which is again an open source API platform which you can use it. Now I'm going to look for the placeholder documentation. Yeah. So look over here. There is something that you guys will notice, which is creating a resource. Now over here, if you would notice, there is something called as stringify. Any idea or anyone amongst you is a backend developer should surely know this. Can I get the answer for what is a stringify, guys? Oh yes, correct. Now, someone has actually answered that stringify means converting the JSON data to one particular model. What do you mean by that? Now, let's see over here when I'm showing this data to you. Do you notice this entire JSON? So this JSON cannot be understood by my Dart. What it does is converts this JSON into my model. And how exactly we are doing it? If you guys would remember, I told you that when we created this API repository, we are using this from JSON and converting it to product model. So how exactly we are going to do it when we are sending this data? In that case, we are going to use something called as a post API, in which if you would see, Along with the documentation, there is something called as stringify. When it was received from the server, it was a JSON. In the same way, when you are sending the data to the server, it's going to be yet another JSON, and that is exactly where you use stringify. Now, if you would notice, when we are trying to get the JSON, we are converting or using something called as from JSON, and when we are trying to send the data, it's something called as to JSON. Now, let me see if you guys have any other queries. No. Yeah. Now, what I'll do is over here explain to you what are these content type. If you would notice, when we are trying to send this data, it has got a header which basically says what is the data type that we are sending it to the server. Like I told you, whenever the communication is going to happen with your mobile or with your server, it's going to be in the JSON format. Hence, you'll notice that over here also I've kept the application as slash JSON. Now, over here, with the help of post, we are sending this data to the server. Now, when it comes to update, when do you update? Just imagine that you are creating an app in which there are two features. The first feature allows the user to create an account. Let's see, this is your user, and your user comes to your app to create an account. Now, when it comes to create an account, there might be a case also that he might update into his account. So here we have our user who's trying to update data into the account. So, which basically means there is already some data which is already there onto the server. Hence, what we're going to do is, in this case, not use post, as post will create a new user onto the server. Then, what should we use? We should be using a put. Put is specifically required when some data for the user is already there and you want to just update it. In that case, you'll also notice that over here the URL just ends with post. However, in this case, there is a post ID that you have to mention. Look over here, there is this post ID that we have to mention, and only then we can send the data. So, hence, if you would notice, now I'll try to erase through the logs and click over here this button, which basically says that we were able to send this data onto the server. Followed by, if you come back to this app again and click on Put API, you'll notice you were able to update this data onto the server. Followed by, there is something called as delete. What is delete? As good as, imagine if you don't require something, same example, if you don't want the user to be there into the system, you just go ahead and delete it. So it will delete, erase of every kind of a data, hence it's called as HTTP delete. Now, over here, let us come to the last part wherein we are going to have our block or the state handling. So where are the states getting created? if you would notice over here, I have loading. Let me go over here. Yeah, so we have loading followed by product list and followed by error. Now, if you would notice, when I click on this, loading happens and you're able to see the product. What will happen if my API does not return any kind of a data? In this case, I'll go over here, put over here 1, 2, 3, and see how does this thing work. Do you notice something went wrong? How did this thing happen? Like over here, I was telling you, if my status code is not 200, then we are not going to send the data. So let us see what is the status code that we received. It is 404. Hence, anything apart from 200 shall be ignored and you are going to get this error into the app. So, which basically means I'm going to erase this so that I can clearly see through the data. Now, if I would run the code again, you'll notice I'll be able to successfully get the data.